colonial America gets sold to us like a wholesome little world of candles, wooden houses, and hard-working pioneers. Cute story. The real version was filthier, stranger, smellier, and way more unhinged. We're talking beer for kids, shared beds with strangers, wigs full of bugs, and daily life that felt one bad decision away from a public disaster. This is 32 Weird Realities of Life in Colonial America. 1. Let's start with colonial interior design, which apparently asked one bold question. What if your living room was also a sandbox for germs? Instead of carpets or polished floors, many homes were covered with a layer of sand. Actual sand. Indoors. The idea was that it would soak up spills, grease, dirt, crumbs, and whatever else people dragged in from the outside world, which sounds efficient until you remember that all of that filth was still sitting there under your feet. Then, every so often, they would sweep away the top layer and call the place refreshed. So yes, they basically handled household hygiene by creating a tiny indoor beach full of food waste and shoe sludge. It was less cleaning and more rearranging the gross part. You bought a house, then immediately gave it the floor plan of a stable. A truly visionary age for people who looked at dirt and thought, maybe more dirt will solve this. 2. Modern travelers complain if the hotel pillow is too soft. Colonial travelers had bigger issues like waking up spooning a complete stranger. At taverns and inns, private rooms were often a fantasy for the wealthy. Regular people usually got a place in a shared bed, not a room, a bed, which meant you climbed under the blankets beside whoever had already been assigned there. Maybe it was a merchant. Maybe it was a trapper who smelled like wet leather and bad decisions. Maybe both. Hospitality back then was basically forced intimacy with zero warning and no refund policy. You could arrive exhausted from a long trip and end up sleeping elbow to elbow with two men whose life stories you absolutely did not ask for. Imagine opening your eyes at dawn and realizing the mustached guy inches from your face is not your brother, cousin, or friend, just your temporary mattress partner. Colonial lodging was not rest. It was a socially acceptable hostage arrangement with blankets. 3. In colonial America, a healthy family breakfast could include bread, porridge, and a cheerful mug of beer for the children. Because water was often unsafe, people regularly drank small beer, which had lower alcohol content but was still, let us be honest, beer. So yes, little kids could start the day with a mild buzz before doing chores. Nothing says responsible parenting like handing your 6-year-old a morning drink because the well might murder him. The logic made sense for the time, but it still creates a glorious mental image of an entire society functioning in a permanent fog of low-level fermentation. Adults drank it, kids drank it, everyone drank it, because the alternative was gambling with dysentery. So when you picture stern colonial life, remember that a good chunk of it was carried out by people who were never fully sober and never fully drunk, just gently marinated from sunrise onward. Suddenly the era feels a lot less pious and a lot more lightly pickled. 4. If you think a modern sermon feels long, colonial church would have broken you like a cheap chair. A Sunday service could stretch for hours, and the sermons were not warm little talks about kindness or community. They were extended verbal assaults about sin, hell, divine wrath, and the horrifying ways your soul could suffer forever. Preachers leaned hard into terror. Jonathan Edwards and others did not gently invite people toward faith. They basically described eternal punishment in such vivid detail that the congregation probably needed emotional reconstruction afterward. Fire, screaming, endless torment, no exits. Have a blessed day. The point was not comfort. The point was to frighten people so badly that obedience started to look relaxing. Church was less a spiritual recharge and more a live performance of cosmic psychological warfare. Miss one Sunday and next week you'd be back in the pew, mostly because you had been mentally shown a full guided tour of hell and were not eager to book the trip. 5. Modern people have no real relationship with darkness. Colonial people absolutely did, and it was a menace. Once the sun dropped, the world outside your candle flame basically vanished. No streetlights, no neon signs, no porch lamps, no soft glow from a distant gas station, just total blackness pressing against the windows like it wanted in. Step outside at night, and you were moving through a void that could hide a ditch, a thief, a riverbank, a wild animal, or all four if the universe was feeling creative. Night travel was not inconvenient. It was a direct invitation to disappear in a field and become a cautionary tale. Even familiar paths turned treacherous after dark. The darkness itself felt like a thing, not just the absence of light, but a heavy living curtain that swallowed distance, sound, and common sense. Half the day belonged to this enormous black unknown. No wonder people developed superstitions. If your whole town vanished every evening, your imagination would start freelancing too. 6. One of the quiet luxuries of modern life is that shoes now acknowledge the radical concept that your left foot and right foot are different. Colonial shoes did not. They were called straights, which means both shoes were made exactly the same. No left, no right, just two identical leather traps waiting to negotiate violently with your feet. To make them wearable, you had to break them in, which sounds polite until you remember it really meant suffering through days or weeks of blisters while your feet bullied the leather into submission. Every walk was a hostile negotiation between flesh and stubborn cowhide. Imagine putting on shoes that begin each morning by insulting your entire skeletal structure. And because both shoes were equally wrong, there was no relief, only symmetry in pain. Colonists were out here building farms, crossing muddy roads, and hauling supplies while wearing footwear designed with the ergonomic philosophy of a brick. Honestly, their bad moods start making a lot more sense once you realize their shoes hated them personally. 7. The fireplace was the beating heart of the colonial home, which sounds cozy right up until you remember it was also basically an open portal to disaster. It heated the house, cooked the meals, dried the clothes, and occasionally tried to kill everyone inside. These were huge open fires sitting in wooden houses, often connected to chimneys lined with soot and creosote, which is just another way of saying they kept a combustion experiment running in the middle of their living room all winter. One stray spark could leap out, catch cloth or timber, and turn the home into a bonfire before anyone had time to scream properly. And because buildings were packed closely together, one family's bad evening could become the whole street's apocalypse in minutes. The thing keeping you alive through freezing weather was also the #1 candidate to erase your property from the map. Colonial heating was basically a survival pact with fire, and fire was not known for honoring agreements. 8. The fork had a rough public relations campaign in early America, which is incredible when you remember its main talent is helping food reach your mouth efficiently. Many colonists viewed forks as suspiciously fancy, overly European, and somehow morally questionable, especially Italian. Because apparently somewhere along the line, a piece of cutlery became part of an ideological struggle against softness, so people often use knives, spoons, or just their hands instead. You'd think a tool designed to stab peas would be universally welcomed, but no. Some treated it like a decadent little menace trying to corrupt honest society one noodle at a time. There were even religious objections floating around, as if the devil had personally invented the fork to weaken masculine resolve during supper. So this was a culture willing to fight for liberty, frontier survival, and religious conviction, but still capable of staring at a utensil and deciding it represented moral decline. Imagine being threatened by an object whose greatest crime is understanding pasta better than you do. 9. Puritan courtship produced one of the strangest romantic systems ever attempted by people who clearly did not trust hormones but somehow trusted furniture. The practice was called bundling, and yes, it involved an unmarried couple spending the night together in the same bed while separated by a wooden board or wrapped up in ways meant to prevent anything scandalous. Because obviously nothing keeps desire under control like one heroic plank. The whole setup feels like a chastity plan designed by someone who had never met a teenager. Parents looked at this arrangement and genuinely thought, yes, this should be fine. We have deployed lumber. That board was not security. It was optimistic carpentry. It was the moral equivalent of drawing a line in the sand and hoping biology respects boundaries. You can almost hear the confidence in the room. We have placed timber between them. What could possibly go wrong? Colonial romance was less dating and more a deeply awkward experiment in supervised temptation with hardware store energy. 10. Colonial children did not get the soft, cheerful toy market we associate with modern childhood. Their playthings often looked like something assembled by a grieving poet in a candlelit basement. Death was so common that it was woven directly into family life, and children's toys reflected that grim familiarity. Dolls could come with funeral accessories. Tiny coffins existed. In some cases, especially in Europe, toy guillotines even appeared after political upheaval, because apparently nothing says wholesome recreation like simulated execution before lunch. The goal was not to shield children from mortality, but to introduce it early, bluntly, and without much ceremony. Life was fragile. Siblings died young. Disease was everywhere, and adults treated this as a practical reality kids should learn fast. So while modern children get colorful plastic dinosaurs, colonial kids were sometimes handed mini funeral props and told, in effect, "Welcome to existence, it's not going great." It was educational, deeply unsettling, and about as emotionally nurturing as a tax audit. 11. If a marriage collapsed in the lower ranks of society, colonial life had a brutally efficient workaround that sounds fake, but was not. Wife selling. Instead of lawyers, court filings, and months of paperwork, a husband could bring his wife to a public market and symbolically sell her, often with her consent, to another man. It was crude, embarrassing, and astonishingly transactional, like turning a domestic crisis into a village event. A ribbon around the waist, a crowd watching, bids being made, and there you have it, a relationship dissolved with the energy of livestock trading. Strange as it sounds, many wives accepted it because legal divorce was expensive or nearly impossible, and this bizarre ritual functioned as a public escape hatch. Still, the image is wild. Your marriage doesn't end in mediation. It ends beside produce and chickens while strangers assess the situation like they're pricing secondhand furniture. Colonial society really looked at emotional collapse and said, let's make this faster, louder, and somehow even more humiliating. 12. Before alarm clocks, people still had jobs, which meant someone had to perform the ancient and sacred duty of ruining your sleep on schedule. Enter the knocker-upper, a real profession in which a person walked around before dawn tapping on windows with a long stick until clients finally woke up. If you lived higher up, the stick got longer. That was the technology. Not bells, not smart devices, just a professional nuisance with reach. Imagine paying a stranger to stand outside your house in the freezing dark and repeatedly whack your window because otherwise you'd miss another glorious day of exhausting labor. It was basically a subscription service for irritation. And the best part is the obvious philosophical nightmare hiding inside it. Who woke up the knocker-upper? Did another knocker-upper do it? Was there a master knocker? Did they simply never sleep? The whole arrangement feels like society accidentally built an absurdist comedy sketch and then treated it like infrastructure. Colonial mornings were not peaceful. They began with an appointed enemy and a stick. 13. Today, gossip might get you blocked or dragged in a group chat. In Puritan New England, it could get you publicly punished with machinery that sounds like it was designed by someone holding a grudge against the human spirit. Women labeled common scolds, meaning habitual troublemakers or loud arguers, could face punishments like the cucking stool, where they were strapped into a chair and dunked repeatedly into a river or pond for everyone to watch. Because obviously the proper response to neighborhood drama is aquatic humiliation. Even worse was the scold's bridle, an iron mask fitted with a gag that pressed on the tongue to physically stop speech. They literally turned social annoyance into medieval hardware. It is breathtakingly excessive. Instead of ignoring nosy people, they built devices. Colonial justice had a real flair for saying, yes, this minor interpersonal problem definitely requires public torment and metal face equipment. The message was simple: mind your words, or the state will enthusiastically become weird about it. 14. Before cameras, preserving the memory of a loved one could mean hiring an artist to paint them after they had already died. Post-mortem portraiture was not rare, especially for children, because death came fast and often, and many families had no existing likeness of the person they lost. So painters were brought in to create one final image, sometimes arranging the body to appear sleeping peacefully, or even faintly alive. To us, it sounds deeply eerie. To them, it was a precious last chance to keep a face from slipping away forever. And that's what makes it so haunting. This was not morbid for the sake of drama. It came from grief, scarcity, and the desperate need to hold on to something visible when life could vanish without warning. The result sits in that uncomfortable space where tenderness and creepiness shake hands. It is heartbreaking, intimate, and just unsettling enough to remind you how familiar death once was inside ordinary homes. 15. In colonial America, clothing was not just fashion. It was social surveillance with buttons. Sumptuary laws dictated what people were allowed to wear based on class, wealth, and status. So even if you somehow saved enough money for a nicer outfit, the law might still say absolutely not. Those materials are for your betters. Silk, lace, ornate trim, too many fancy buttons, all of that could be restricted if society had decided your income did not deserve sparkle. Imagine getting in trouble because your outfit looked too successful for your job description. It is hard to overstate how petty and controlling this was. Your wardrobe had to publicly signal your place in the social ladder at all times, like a walking badge of acceptable ambition. Colonial society did not want upward mobility looking too visible. It wanted class lines stitched directly into fabric. Dress too well, and suddenly your pants were not pants anymore. They were evidence of dangerous levels of unauthorized elegance. 16. Colonial justice occasionally reached a level of stupidity so pure it almost becomes art, and animal trials are a perfect example. If a pig injured a child or some other farm animal caused serious trouble, people might not just kill it and move on. They could actually put the animal on trial. Formal charges, witnesses, sometimes even legal representation for an animal. A pig could be accused, judged, sentenced, and publicly executed as though it had knowingly committed a crime after weighing the consequences. This was a world willing to use the full theater of human law on creatures whose main goals in life were food, sleep, and wandering into places they should not be. Picture the courtroom logic required to arrive at, "This goat must answer for its actions." It is magnificent bureaucratic nonsense. They were not just dealing with danger. They were assigning moral responsibility to livestock. Somewhere, a prosecutor was essentially trying to establish criminal intent in a barnyard, and no one in the room stopped to ask whether reality had left the building. 17. In modern cities, the glamorous public figures are celebrities, founders, and people with suspiciously white teeth on podcasts. In colonial towns, one of the genuine heroes was the rat catcher. And honestly, fair enough. Colonial settlements were overflowing with garbage, food waste, animal remains, and enough filth to support a rat population of biblical confidence. These were not a few skittering nuisances in the alley. This was a full-scale rodent civilization thriving right outside your door, tearing through grain stores, spreading disease, and reminding everyone that human ambition means very little when outnumbered by teeth. The rat catcher, often aided by lethal little terriers, was the man standing between the town and total furry chaos. He was not seen as lowly. He was a specialist in urban survival. When he showed up, it meant help had arrived. In a world constantly one bad season away from disaster, the person who could reduce the rat army was not just useful. He was practically a civic warrior with a sack and a mission. 18. In colonial America, the person trimming your beard might also be the person removing your tooth, draining your blood, or slicing into an infection, which is a sentence that should make every modern person grateful for specialization. Barbers often doubled as surgeons and dentists, because apparently society looked at razors and thought, yes, this skill set should absolutely extend into medicine. Need a shave? Fine. Need a tooth yanked? Also fine. Want to be bled because somebody thinks your humors are acting up? Pull up a chair. The same hands handling facial grooming might also be handling open wounds, usually without any understanding of germs, sterilization, or the concept of not using the same cloth for everything. It was not a healthcare system so much as a chaos bundle with a striped pole. You could walk in wanting to look respectable and walk out with an infection, blood loss, and a powerful new distrust of local services. Colonial grooming came with the thrilling possibility of accidental surgery. 19. People mock modern weird money like crypto, but colonial Virginia ran an economy on tobacco, which is somehow even more chaotic because at least a cryptocurrency wallet cannot rot in a barn. Tobacco was not just a crop, it functioned as currency. Taxes could be paid in it, salaries were calculated in it, debts were settled in it, and a man's wealth could be measured in dried leaves stacked in storage. Picture walking into a tavern and effectively paying for drinks with agricultural inventory. The whole system tied financial stability to weather, pests, disease, and whether your crop happened to look decent that year. One bad harvest and your balance sheet was suddenly a tragedy. Your prosperity could literally mildew. That is an astonishing level of economic fragility. Colonial planning was basically, let us hope the plant cooperates. Forget market volatility on a screen. Their version was checking the field and realizing your retirement has been eaten by worms, soaked by rain, or casually trampled by something with hooves. 20. Colonial America did not treat childhood the way we do, which becomes very obvious once you look at marriage patterns. For many girls, marriage in the early teens was not some rare scandal in the background. It could be a socially accepted expectation, especially in communities where life was hard, life was short, and labor mattered more than emotional development. The logic was brutal. Start a household early, produce children early, put everyone to work early. A girl who today would still be worried about homework and awkward school pictures could, in that world, be expected to manage a home, serve a husband, and begin motherhood almost immediately. The very idea of a protected, leisurely adolescence barely existed for most people. You were little, until suddenly you were not. Colonial society did not ease anyone into adulthood. It shoved them across the line and handed them chores, responsibility, and probably a baby. It is one of those realities that makes the past feel less distant and more like a completely different species of civilization. 21. Doing business in colonial America could feel like trying to negotiate inside a fever dream because there was no universal agreement on basic measurements. A gallon in one colony might not match a gallon in another. A pound here could mean something different there. Measures for grain, nails, cloth, and liquid could shift depending on where you stood, which turned ordinary trade into a daily argument about reality itself. You were not just haggling over price. You were haggling over what the word pound even meant in this particular town on this particular day. Imagine trying to build a house, sell produce, or settle a debt when every measuring system is essentially a local rumor. It is honestly impressive that commerce happened at all. Colonial trade operated on a heroic blend of approximation, confidence, and mutual exhaustion. They were constructing an economy without first agreeing on the size of the bucket. That is like trying to run a modern business while every calculator in the room has a different opinion about numbers. 22. The colonial menu was full of dishes that sound less like dinner and more like revenge. This was an era where people cheerfully served things like jellied eel, which is exactly as sinister as it sounds. Boiled eel reduced into a wobbling fish gel is not cuisine. It is an edible threat. Then there was beaver tail, which some religious authorities classified as acceptable on meatless days, because apparently once theology gets hungry, zoology leaves the chat. So people roasted and ate the fatty tail of a giant rodent and called it practical. Colonial food culture had a real talent for turning necessity into something your taste buds would take personally. We tend to romanticize old-fashioned cooking, but a lot of it was just survival wrapped in very optimistic language. This was not an age of farm-to-table charm. It was a period where dinner could plausibly arrive looking like a dare. People were out here chewing on strange animal parts and congealed river nightmares because hunger has a way of lowering culinary standards into the basement. 23. You might assume that people living in dirty colonial towns would jump at any chance to bathe. That would be a reasonable thought, which is exactly why colonial logic swerves in the opposite direction. Many people feared bathing too much because they believed water opened the pores and allowed disease to enter the body. So instead of scrubbing off filth, they often preferred to leave a protective layer of grime in place, as if grease and sweat formed some kind of defensive armor against illness. It is an astonishing misunderstanding of hygiene. The same society surrounded by mud waste, and terrible smells could still look at a bath and think, risky. Full-body washing might happen rarely, and not everyone was eager to tempt fate by getting too clean. So imagine crowded houses, long workdays, wool clothing, open fires, and summer heat, all combined with a national suspicion of bathing. Church must have smelled less like salvation and more like a biological event. Colonial health theory truly had the confidence of a man explaining nonsense while standing ankle-deep in it. 24. A toothache in colonial America was less a medical issue and more the opening scene of a nightmare. One common old belief blamed tooth pain on a toothworm, a tiny creature supposedly burrowing inside the tooth and causing misery. Because when your understanding of anatomy collapses, naturally you invent haunted mouthbugs. Treatments could be just as wild. Some practitioners tried to smoke the worm out using fumes from substances like henbane, which is a hallucinogenic plant and therefore an absolutely unhinged thing to involve in dental care. So instead of pain relief, you might get dizziness, visions, and the strong sense that your face had joined a folk horror festival. And if that failed, the next step was often brute force extraction with crude tools and no meaningful anesthesia. Just metal, panic, and enough screaming to alert the neighborhood. Colonial dentistry was not a profession you trusted. It was a desperate gamble in which the best possible outcome was losing only the tooth and not your will to continue existing. 25. Colonists had many fears, but one of the strangest was their intense suspicion of night air. They believed that the air after dark carried harmful vapors, a poisonous miasma that could creep into the body and cause illness. So when evening came, windows and doors were often shut tight, even during unbearable heat. Fresh air, in their minds, was not refreshing. It was a stealth attack. This meant families willingly sealed themselves into hot, crowded rooms with smoke, body odor, damp clothing, and all the warmth of a badly ventilated bread oven, because at least the deadly breeze was outside where it belonged. Imagine surviving a humid summer by choosing to marinate indoors with several unwashed relatives and calling that health-conscious. The theory made sense only if you fully committed to the idea that the atmosphere itself had evil intentions after sunset. Colonial medicine really excelled at identifying the wrong enemy. The danger was not always the cool breeze from the window. Sometimes it was the room full of people afraid to open it. 26. Sending mail in colonial America involved a level of privacy so bad it makes a public social media account look discreet. In many places, the local tavern functioned as the post office. Yes, the bar. The person pouring ale and half listening to fights might also be handling your letters. Mail could sit in open boxes or be left out where anyone could inspect it, which means your business papers, family news, and romantic confessions were basically sharing shelf space with spilled cider and village curiosity. Security depended less on systems and more on whether the nosiest drunk in the room felt like snooping that day. It is hard to imagine a worse environment for confidential communication. The whole arrangement was wonderfully reckless. Need to send important information across the colonies? Fantastic. Just trust the tavern crowd and hope nobody with sticky fingers or a loud opinion gets there first. Colonial mail was not safeguarded by institutions. It was protected by vibes, wooden boxes, and a very generous definition of the word postmaster. 27. Today, pigeons are mostly seen as grubby little urban opportunists. In colonial North America, their distant cousin, the passenger pigeon, was an overwhelming natural spectacle on a scale that almost sounds invented. These flocks were not small clusters of birds fluttering through the trees. They were colossal, moving masses that could darken the sky for hours, sometimes longer, with billions of birds traveling together in numbers so absurd they felt biblical. The noise alone was enormous. Their droppings blanketed the ground. When they landed, they could break branches under sheer weight. Imagine looking up at midday and watching the sun vanish behind a living cloud of wings. That stops being charming very quickly. It turns into avian domination. For people on the ground, it must have felt like nature briefly reminding humans that their little settlements were not actually in charge of much. A flock that large was no cute migration. It was a full airborne occupation by birds with terrifying organizational skills. 28. The smell of a colonial city must have been so aggressive it deserves its own chapter in human suffering. There was no modern sanitation system, no reliable garbage collection, no proper sewer network, and not nearly enough shame. People dumped waste into the streets, tossed chamber pot contents out windows, left food scraps where they fell, and generally treated public space like one giant experiment in decomposition. Add animals, mud, stagnant water, heat, and human density, and the result was less a town and more a fermented assault on the senses. Walking through a city like Boston on a hot day was not a pleasant stroll. It was olfactory combat. Historians sometimes use calm phrases to describe this, but honestly, it sounds like the air itself was trying to file a complaint. The truly amazing part is that many people believed bad smells caused disease while continuing to create enough bad smell to launch a new religion. Colonial urban life was held together by commerce, survival, and a frankly supernatural tolerance for stink. 29. When colonial cities wanted running water, they looked around at the available materials and somehow concluded that wood was the answer. So they built water pipes out of hollowed-out logs, pipes, for water, made from the one thing famously eager to rot when constantly wet. It is such a spectacularly doomed idea that you almost have to admire the confidence. These wooden pipes leaked, cracked, shifted, clogged, and delivered water with all the elegance of a wounded garden project. Dirt got in. Debris got in. Probably a few things with legs got in. The result was often a muddy trickle that inspired very little trust and probably should not have inspired thirst either. It was engineering by optimism. You can practically hear the meeting. Will the wood survive long-term exposure to moisture? Let us not burden ourselves with negativity. Colonial infrastructure deserves credit for trying, but this was still basically a citywide attempt to transport water through giant damp sticks and hope civilization happened around it. 30. For many people, the road to the so-called American opportunity began with indentured servitude, which sounds tidy in textbooks and looked much uglier in reality. You signed a contract trading years of your life for passage across the Atlantic, often with only a hazy idea of what waited on the other side. The voyage itself was dangerous, disease-ridden, and miserable. Then, once you arrived, your labor belonged to a master who controlled your time, movements, discipline, and future until the contract expired. He could sell that contract to someone else. He could punish you. If you ran away, your sentence could be extended. This was marketed as a path forward, but for many it felt closer to being leased like equipment. Freedom and prosperity were promised eventually, after several years of being worked hard under someone else's authority. Colonial recruitment had serious bait-and-switch energy. Come to the new world, they said. Just ignore the part where your young adulthood might be consumed by forced labor and the legal status of a very exhausted asset. 31. Colonial beauty standards had a real talent for turning cosmetics into long-term self-destruction. Among wealthy women, pale skin was prized because it signaled status, leisure, and the fact that you did not work outside. To achieve that fashionable look, some used face powders containing white lead, which is about as reassuring as seasoning your breakfast with poison for better texture. The effect could seem glamorous at first, but the long-term consequences were horrific. Skin damage, hair loss, tooth discoloration, mental decline, and serious illness all came with the package. So yes, people were literally applying toxic substances to their faces in pursuit of elegance. It is one of those historical details that sounds exaggerated until you realize fashion has always been willing to step onto a cliff if society calls it chic. The commitment is almost impressive in a deeply terrible way. Colonial beauty culture looked at health, gave it a polite nod, then chose the makeup routine most likely to transform high status into a slow-motion medical emergency. 32. A colonial wig was not just a fashion statement. It was a powdered monument to money, vanity, and appalling hygiene. Wealthy men wore elaborate wigs made from human hair, animal hair, or whatever else could be turned into status and piled onto a scalp. These things were often styled with grease, pomade, and powders, but not regularly washed, which meant they became luxurious little ecosystems for lice and other horrors. Imagine wearing a formal parasite hotel to prove you were important. The smell alone must have been an event. Some people even carried special scratching sticks so they could discreetly attack the itch without ruining the shape of the wig. That is not sophistication. That is pest management in evening wear. And because many of these wigs were coated with fat-based products, they were also delightfully flammable, because why stop at bugs when you can add fire risk too? Colonial elite fashion really said, let us build a social symbol that is expensive, uncomfortable, filthy, and one candle away from disaster. So after all that, colonial America really was not the charming old-timey postcard people pretend it was. It was a place where even getting dressed, going to sleep, or eating dinner could turn bizarre fast. Now here's the real question, and do not play nice in the comments. Which colonial reality was the most insane, and what weird, gross, or completely ridiculous fact did this video leave out that absolutely deserved a spot here? Drop it below and argue your case. And if you want more history that gets weirder the deeper it goes, hit like, subscribe, and stay here.